I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. The Islamic State and the Takfiri jihadists of the Middle East making war on Iraq and Syria simultaneously, but also on the people of the region, especially people seen as Europeans who have come to offer good works as teachers, as working in the medical field. We saw the horror of some of the executions these last days, especially upset the British Prime Minister David Cameron, who called it the execution of yet another British citizen savage. Now we have the good news of a British citizen who was released by his abductors in the Middle East, this time not, to our knowledge, by the Islamic State, but by men who are very similar as jihadists. To help me tell this story is Olivier Guita, who's an international security and global strategist working in London. And the good news you might have missed because there's so much bad news. The man's name is David Bolam. He was released in these last days. He was a principal in the international school Benghazi. That's a clue as to how vulnerable he was. Mr. Bolam had decided to stay even after all the dispute, turmoil, and violence of the last year. Olivier, a very good evening to you. Do we know the group that abducted Bolam? Did anybody name themselves? And is there a link to the Islamic State? Good evening.
Good evening, John. The group that was stating in the video that I saw back in August before this came to light is calling themselves Jund al-Islam, the Army of Islam. It's, I think, just a facade. It's most probably a group that could be linked to Ansar al-Sharia, who's the main group acting in Benghazi, and they have the same modus operandi than another group linked to Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, and they're very prone at taking Westerner hostages. I will put to you that at this point, none of the groups so far in Libya have pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. They're much more in the Al-Qaeda world rather than anything else. But what's interesting about this is that Mr. Bolam was abducted in May, and there was a total blackout from the press and from people like me, not to mention anything because negotiations were ongoing, and the Foreign Office in London was afraid that by publicizing his abduction, his release would be jeopardized.
The abduction looks to have taken place somewhere in May, and then we had this video in August. The video is chilling in that it looks very much to be the same setup that led to tragedy by the Islamic State. He says in the video, "I am a British teacher. My health is good at the moment. I have been here a very long time. I asked the British government and Prime Minister David Cameron, please allow me to go back to my family. I ask my family and friends and anyone else who hears this, please, can you do something to let the government understand I need to go home? Please, please do something to help me." I notice a distinction here, Olivia, and I wonder if it's significant. He's not making threats against the parliament or against the leadership in the Cameron government about their conduct in the Middle East in any fashion. He is making an appeal to a family. It's suggestive that he can be purchased. Is that what they mean to communicate in that video?
Yes, very much so. And the most striking part in that video is that he said they are asking for a release of prisoners, of jihadists from different countries, exactly like the Americans did. And it is obviously referring to Bo Bergdahl. But that's what's really changing the picture, because as you can remember, the British government is very adamant on not paying ransom, negotiating with terrorists, or giving in. But now when you look at the facts and the coincidences that happened in the past few weeks, this is troubling. A deal has been made, whether it's financial, like the BBC reported that a large ransom was paid, or the release of prisoners. And I would tend to look at the release of prisoners for two things. That group specifically asked for the release of Abu Qatada, who was one of the major Al-Qaeda figures that used to live in London and that was extradited to Jordan a few years back. He was on trial in Jordan and was facing the death penalty. All of a sudden, about 3 weeks ago, he was released because there were not enough evidence against him. That was the first one. The second person that the jihadists had asked for a release was a man by the name of Moazzam Beg, who is a former Guantanamo detainee, a British citizen that was arrested just a few months ago because he was allegedly recruiting jihadists in Syria. And the case was strong, but all of a sudden, on last Thursday, MI5 told the courts that it didn't have enough evidence to go and prosecute him. Within a few hours of his release, David Bolam was also freed. So you can make whatever you want, but I think the coincidence is quite telling.
I have a striking quote from the Foreign Office. Her Majesty's government does not pay, facilitate, or condone ransom payments, nor make concessions. Our kidnap for ransom policy is clear and long-standing. Ransom payments to terrorists are illegal. We understand that David's release was agreed between local political factions. Her Majesty's government, was not involved. Now, that sounds like a lawyerly statement to me. Is that how I should read it?
Very much so, because look, the British government, we know for a fact that those groups would not release on a whim. So if, for instance, in previous cases, Qatar paid the ransom on behalf of the French or on behalf of the Swiss or the Italians. So if another group or another country paid the ransom, it's exactly the same. It boils down to giving in and to paying ransom. But look, I think it's a major change in British and American policy, what has happened in the past few months, because they were trying to put the blame on other Western European countries to say, look, you are basically negotiating and giving money to those hostage takers, and you're encouraging them to take other hostages. But now, because of what has happened, as you mentioned early in your program in Iraq and the beheadings, there's a big movement, if you will, from the ground up to put pressure on the U.S. and British government to get the hostages back one way or another. So,
as the distinction you make between Ansar al-Sharia, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and the Islamic State, is that a distinction with a difference? Because from this distance, over here on this side of the Atlantic, they all look like Takfiri jihadists who are ruthless and extremely successful.
The difference is that in this case, they were ready to hold off until they got what they wanted, because I would put to you that they knew from the get-go by kidnapping a British citizen that supposedly the Brits would not pay, so that's why they asked for the release of prisoners.
Right.
That was a different demand from other groups.
It reminds me, Olivier, in warfare, the enemy gets a vote, and they adapt. Olivier Guite, International Security and Geopolitical Risk Consultant in London. I'm John Batchelor. David Bolam is home. That's the good news. This is The John Batchelor Show.